Hello and welcome. Today we're diving into the legal side of heartbreak. We're talking about divorce in South Africa. It's this whole system that has to step in when love walks out, and we're going to break down exactly how it all works.
And really, that's the core question, isn't it? What happens in that painful gap when you know a relationship is over emotionally, but you're still legally tied together? How does the law even begin to deal with that?
Well, in South African law, the main answer is something called an irretrievable breakdown. Just think of it as the legal way of saying a marriage is broken beyond repair. It's pretty much the foundation for most divorces today. To really get how this all works in the real world, let's follow two different stories. On one hand, you've got Max. His wife has tragically been in a coma for 18 months, and he feels he needs to move on. And then there's Mignon, newly married, but now really worried about her husband's strange and erratic behavior. Their situations are going to be our guide through this legal maze.
Okay, so what does irretrievable breakdown actually mean in legal terms? The law basically asks two big questions. First, has the marriage relationship stopped being, normal? And second, is there any reasonable chance of putting it back together? If the answer is yes, it's not normal, and no, there's no hope, then legally, that marriage has broken down.
To see how the courts actually apply this, we've got to talk about a really big case, Schwartz versus Schwartz. This case basically wrote the rule book for how judges are supposed to look at this stuff.
So the story in the Schwartz case is pretty simple. You have a husband who's been unfaithful, and he finds someone new. He moves out, and for more than 5 years, he lives with this new partner. Finally, he files for divorce, saying, hey, this marriage is over.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The court's ruling was a game changer. It said, look, our job isn't to figure out who's to blame here. We're not playing the blame game anymore. Instead, the court just has to look at the cold, hard facts. Are they living apart? Yep. Is there someone new in the picture? Yep. Objectively speaking, is this marriage over? The court had to say yes.
And this is the part that really hits home. Once a court looks at the facts and decides the marriage is over, it must grant the divorce. It can't refuse, even if the other person is fighting it and wants to stay married. The objective reality of the situation wins every time.
So that's the general idea of breakdown. But now let's get into some of the more specific and honestly more tragic situations. And this takes us right back to Max and Mignon.
Remember Max? His wife, Rachel, is in a coma, and he's stuck. He wants to move forward with his life, but he's legally married. Now, he could argue for an irretrievable breakdown, but the law actually has a very specific pathway for a situation just like his.
The Divorce Act has this really strict three-part test. First, Rachel has been unconscious for well over the required 6 months. So, check. Second, Max would need 2 different medical experts to testify that there's no reasonable hope she'll recover. And third, and this is so important, the court has the power to order Max to provide for Rachel's financial future to make absolutely sure she is taken care of.
Okay, now let's switch over to Mignon. She's worried about her husband Jeff's mental state and wants out of the marriage. Does the law have a specific rule for her the way it does for Max?
Well, yes it does, but the bar is set incredibly high. For a divorce on the grounds of mental illness, a spouse has to be formally institutionalized or detained for at least 2 straight years. And, just like before, there has to be no reasonable prospect of them recovering.
So for Mignon, this isn't an option. Joff's behavior might be really concerning, but he hasn't been institutionalized, so he doesn't meet any of those strict legal criteria. That specific legal door is closed for her.
So what's she supposed to do? Well, her best bet is to go right back to that very first principle we talked about, irretrievable breakdown. By arguing that the marriage just isn't normal anymore, she can get a divorce. And, more importantly, she can protect her financial interests, which is a huge deal, especially since they were married in community of property.
So far, we've been looking at how individuals try to find justice within the legal system. But what happens when the system itself is the problem? What if it just fails to recognize certain marriages at all? This leads us to a massive constitutional challenge.
This all came to a head in a truly landmark case at the Constitutional Court called the Women's Legal Center Trust versus the President of South Africa. You see, at the heart of this was a huge systemic injustice. For a long time, Muslim marriages, while perfectly valid under religious law, just weren't recognized by South Africa's civil law. And what that meant was that the children from these marriages didn't get the same legal protections as other kids when their parents split up. It was a clear violation of their basic constitutional rights.
So the country's highest court weighed in with a really powerful verdict. It said yes, this lack of recognition is absolutely unconstitutional. It unfairly discriminates against kids just because of their parents' religion and culture.
And then the court put a number on it, 24. It gave Parliament 24 months, just 2 years, to fix this injustice, to change the laws and make sure that every single child gets equal protection, no matter what kind of marriage their parents have.
Okay, so after looking at personal stories and huge systemic problems, what does all this really tell us about divorce law here in South Africa?
When you boil it all down, you see a few key things. The whole idea of irretrievable breakdown gives people a practical way out that's based on reality, not blame. Then you have the specific grounds, which create really clear, though tough, rules for tragic situations. And finally, you see that constitutional challenges are what force the law to grow and change to protect those who need it most.
At the end of the day, what we're really seeing is that South African divorce law isn't just some dry, dusty set of rules. It's a living, breathing system that is constantly trying to find fair answers for incredibly complex and often heartbreaking human problems.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question. If the law really is this living system, always trying to get closer to fairness, what other injustices, the ones we see and maybe the ones we don't, will it be called on to solve next?